Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our Wednesday night devotional at Wilshire. Thanks for joining us. Feel free to share our videos. They'll be posted on our YouTube site at Wilshire and available at Facebook. And we always appreciate you joining us and being part of this on Wednesday nights. Thank you to everybody who helped with the cookout last week. We had several people come through, and several of us were able to stop and visit towards the end of the evening, and lots of people put a lot of time and effort in that. So thank you for all of that, for the setup, the serving, the cleanup. It was great to be out a little bit and enjoy fellowship. And let me remind you also that we are live streaming our Sunday morning worship. You'll be sent an email link Sunday morning. We try to do that about 15 minutes before worship starts. And we also post that on our private YouTube channel. So if you have not been receiving that link or having issues, please let us know. We're trying to make that available for people who don't feel safe, don't feel comfortable getting out right now in the middle of the pandemic. And I know numbers are going up again. People are worried about that. So we want you to still be able to connect and be part of Wilshire. Thank you to all the people, Sean Bailey, Andrew Rice, James Fields, who've been making that work every Sunday morning. We appreciate your efforts. And one other thing I want to address before talking about Philippians tonight, there was controversy, or at least a question raised about the picture that's above my head. Yes, Rachel Huddleston, that is the soup Nazi from Seinfeld. If you've never watched Seinfeld, it won't make any sense, but Ike Wilson brought me that picture. It's even got my name on it. It says, "No soup for you, Jeremy." So that ominous guy staring over my shoulder is the soup Nazi. So thanks for noticing that, Rachel. So last week we went back to our study of Philippians, which we actually started before the pandemic, but everything kind of went crazy on us. And since Jim finished Hebrews, we stepped back into that study of Philippians. Now last week we talked a little about the history of this church and how this is the gospel goes to Europe for the first time. This is the first time non-Jewish opposition arises to Paul's ministry and how that unfolds in Philippi. He meets Lydia. He baptizes the Philippian jailer. He talks a lot about, or you set up this issue of Roman citizenship, and can you be a Roman citizen and can you be a Christian, and how that kind of plays out with Paul in Acts 16. And all of that kind of is in the background as Paul sits down to write Dear Philippi, this letter to the Philippian church. Our old friend, Brother Avon Malone, used to call it his sweetheart church, the church in Philippi. As you read the book, you have such great love and connection for the work that this church has done in supporting Paul. We don't send letters very often. When I was in high school, middle school, high school, my brother went off to Germany. He was in active duty military. And boy, it was strange for him not to live at home. And so we would get letters. He would tell us about what's going on. He would tell us about what he had experienced the week before. But you always knew when Jamie sent a letter home, there would be a section of that letter that would be really discouraging because he was really homesick. But when you read Philippians, you can just imagine when they show up and say, hey, Paul has sent a letter. Everybody knows Paul's circumstance. This is one of the prison epistles, so Paul writes this while he's in prison. And we don't know when, at what point in prison. If you follow the storyline of Acts, Paul is actually in a Roman prison for 4 years. He's waiting for his day in court, so to speak, with Caesar. He had appealed to Caesar. And we think it's in that 4-year span, maybe, that Paul writes this letter of Philippians. And what we know is Paul's in prison. We don't know how his case is going to turn out. We don't know if he's going to face the death penalty, if he's going to be released, what's going to happen to Paul. We also know that they had sent someone named Epaphroditus. We meet him in chapter 2 of Philippians. They had sent him out to check on Paul and to minister to Paul. And you learn in this letter that Epaphroditus, while he's gone, he gets sick. Paul says he almost dies. And so there are all these questions when someone shows up and says, we got a letter from Paul. And you're thinking, what's going on with Paul? Is he going to get out? Has he heard anything? How's Epaphroditus? What are they going to do to us? I mean, if Paul's a Roman citizen and he's in prison for being a Christian, what's going to happen to us? And you can almost sense, at least I do when I read Philippians, I don't know if I want to read this letter. I mean, Paul would be discouraged. It's going to be a downer of a letter. So you open the letter and you start to read, and it's the opposite of that. Instead of all of this weighing Paul down and all of this discouraging Paul, Paul is fresh and he's excited and he's seeing everything that happens through the lens of the gospel. So for instance, Philippians chapter 1, verse 3, Paul says, I thank my God always. I remember you always in my prayers with joy because of your partnership in the gospel from the first day until now. Paul says, yeah, I'm in prison and I'm so grateful for you. I'm so thankful for our partnership in the gospel, how your faith has grown, how your faith has encouraged me, and how it continues to partner with me in the gospel. So it's not a downer letter. It's not some lament of sorts that's going to discourage the church. In fact, Paul uses this term joy multiple times in Philippians. And if anyone had any reason to be discouraged, it's Paul. Everything he's facing, and he comes out of the gate saying, man, things are great. So how do you do that? I mean, you watch the news today, and every day something new is happening. The numbers for the virus are going up. The protests in the street demanding justice and the reaction to that, it can be overwhelming and discouraging. And then you've got the rioting and the looting separate from the protesting. And you watch the news and you watch politicians respond to that, and you just think, how much worse could things get? And if you were to send a letter to someone not in our country or anywhere at the time is facing this, but if you could send a letter to someone outside of this, would you sound this optimistic? Well, Paul does. How does he do that? Well, as you read through chapter 1 of Philippians, everything that's happening, Paul sees through a particular lens. Here's the lens. Chapter 1, verse 12. I want you to know, brothers, that what has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel. Paul had a way of looking at everything going on around him and finding a way for the gospel not just to survive, but for the gospel to thrive and advance in that situation. So, for instance, Paul's in prison. And as you read chapter 1, he says, you know what? This has turned out for the better. Because here I am in prison, and everyone in the guard watching me knows that my chains are for Jesus Christ. Now remember, one of the first converts in the church at Philippi was the jailer who guarded Paul. And I wonder what he thought if he relived his story when he heard, look, my chains have worked out well. And this guy could retell his story that, well, that's how I came to know Jesus. Paul's doing it again. And he says, everyone throughout the guard knows why I'm here. And I always imagine these guys watching Paul through their part of the night or through their part of the day, and Paul striking up a conversation with them. They ask, why are you here? What are you in for? Paul says, I believe in Jesus. Have you heard of Jesus? And Paul gets to tell his story. He's a prisoner. And as they change guards, Paul has a new conversation. And everyone in the Praetorian Guard, the special select group of guards, is hearing Paul's story, and he's hearing the story of the gospel. So you would think Paul would be very discouraged by being in jail, and he says, no, I've started a prison ministry from the inside. I'm sharing the gospel of Jesus. Well, what about what other people are saying? Paul, if Paul only knew what people were saying about him, people in the church, and that doesn't discourage Paul either. Verse 15, it's true, some preach Christ out of envy and rivalry, but others out of goodwill. The latter do so in love, knowing that I am put here for the defense of the gospel. The former preach Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, supposing that they can stir up trouble for me while I am in chains. But what does it matter? The important thing is that in every way, whether false motives or true, Christ is preached. And because of that, I rejoice. It's almost as if Paul says, let them say what they want to say about me. As long as they're talking about Jesus, I'm okay. again, it's an example of Paul finding a way for the gospel to advance. It's not about Paul. It's not about how I shouldn't be in prison and I should get out of here. It's about how is the gospel working in this moment. And so sure, they're going to say bad things about me, but you know what? They're talking about Jesus, and that's a good thing. Well, what about Paul's case? Is Paul going to live? Is Paul going to die? Are they going to release Paul? Is he going to face the death penalty? And Paul says, I really don't know. I continue to rejoice. I'm grateful to be here, but I think I'll be free. But you know what? Whether I live or die, the cause of Christ continues. If I die, I get to be with Christ. And if I live, I get to live out Christ. I get to teach Jesus and show Jesus and spread the gospel even more. And so you get here in Philippians chapter 1, for me to live is Christ and to die is gain. Now, he'll unpack that more in chapter 2, what it means to live Christ out. But for now, Paul says, either way, the gospel is going to advance. And what he calls on the church in Philippi to do is to live out their life and their ministry, to live as citizens of the kingdom of God. This phrase he uses towards the end of chapter 1, to live in a worthy manner, is the language of living as a faithful, good citizen of God's kingdom. So Paul says, when you see me suffering and you see me in chains, I don't want you to be discouraged by that. I don't want you to give up because of that. I want you to look into my situation and see where God is still at work doing remarkable things. Again, we watch the news, and it's discouraging, brothers and sisters. It's frustrating to see injustice continue. It's frustrating to see people suffer from the pandemic and from the sickness. It's frustrating to see the economic conditions that's come about by all that. But if we want to see things the way Paul did and find joy in the midst of this, then ask yourself when you watch the news, how will the gospel advance in this moment? How can God use this moment to do things that no one expects? Who knows, there may be another Philippian jailer come out of this moment for Paul. Who knows but that the person who was teaching out of envy and strife, as they mention Jesus, it dawns on them who Jesus actually is. Paul says, one way or the other, the gospel is going to advance. And I'm seeing that even in the moments we're living in. There have been more conversations, real and sincere conversations about what it means for us to be the church, what justice and mercy and peace really look like. We've had, even at Wilshire, some deep conversations with brothers and sisters about what's happening in the news and what our response ought to be as the Church of Jesus Christ. My whole week I've been on the phone with family members and with friends. Other preachers are calling me to ask, how is Wilshire dealing with this? And what is Wilshire doing about this? Me and someone else, another brother from Wilshire here, was able to talk to a really big church who says, how do we become more integrated? How do we reflect Jesus more to our community? I'm not a fan of self-promotion, but if you're around Friday at 11 o'clock on Facebook, I've been invited to be a part of a conversation on race in the churches of Christ with some other ministers and friends around the country. And some of the things that I'll be sharing are things that I've learned from our brothers and sisters here at Wilshire and through my own life experience. But the fact that these conversations are happening are again an example of God making a way for the gospel to advance, even in the midst of everything that's unfolding. Paul's later going to say in Philippians, don't be anxious for anything. Because Paul knows that God is at work, and he'll use that language. I'm convinced that he who began a good work in you will establish it to the end. Paul can see the long picture in all of this. So he says, don't get lost in the fact that I'm in prison. Don't get lost in the fact that people are preaching Jesus for the wrong reasons. Don't get lost in the fact that I might even die in the midst of this. Rather, see how God is advancing the gospel. So, brothers and sisters, that's our challenge for this week and for all of our lives. Wherever we find ourselves, remind yourself it's ultimately not about me. It's about the gospel advancing. And look for ways for God to do that. I hope you have a wonderful end to your week, and I hope we can see each other on Sunday. God bless.